What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Board Games channel. I am Keith Franks, an award-winning board game and video game designer. And as you can see on the screen, I saw this tweet from Cozy recently talking about some of his most underplayed cards and wondering what kind of things could be done to make these things more viable. And I thought that this would be a really interesting point to go through, have a look at some of these cards, put some of my thoughts on it, some suggestions, and have a look at what could happen to them to put them into a better space. But I kind of want to walk through the whole thing. So what he said was, card nerfs are great and all, but I love when underutilized cards become more viable with a buff. Now there's two different ways that cards can be more viable. The first is by changing the card itself. Some cards that don't do what their original intention was could benefit by being moved more towards a space where it is more efficient at doing that thing, or maybe another card exists that makes that particular card irrelevant as you get later into the pool system. And then changing that card to be better at what it does maybe is a solution there. But the other thing that can make cards more playable is by releasing new cards that fit into the space better. For example, Cyclops was pretty much never played in the Silver Surfer deck, Patriot deck, until Silver Surfer was released. And I think sometimes that is going to be the same kind of sentiment. Now, I'm about to show you the 10 cards in specific that Cozy outlined as the ones that need help. And they are Angel, Sandman, Hawkeye, Medusa, Elektra, Agatha Harkness, Quake, Star-Lord, Blackbolt, and the Punisher. Now we're going to go through each one of these one by one, and we're going to see if we can make these more playable. Okay, we've got first up Angel. Its current ability: when one of your cards are destroyed, this flies out of your deck to replace it. Now, an important thing when looking at these kinds of things is like, what was the original goal of this card, and does something else do what this card does? Now, Embarku does something similar to what Angel does, but it doesn't have that restriction of something needing to be destroyed. But they both have the same problem of being stuck in your hand and they're not doing a thing. So one of the options is, what if we added a clause like America Chavez says, where this card stays in your deck? So it's like, Angel would say, when one of your cards is destroyed, this flies out of your deck to replace it, but it cannot be drawn. And that would just make your deck so insanely consistent that I think you would never want to do that. And then the other option is replacing it, instead of meaning putting me in its spot, would mean that I am put there and I gain its stats, would also be insane. You would add like another Taskmaster effect. The downside to that specific thing is that if you destroy something, like you're killmongering something, or you are deathlock onto the Bucky Barnes, Angel comes out and is a 1. If you venom a bunch of big things, like if you venom a Typhoid Mary, for example, Angel comes out and it's a 10. But the later you wait into the game, the higher chance you have of drawing Angel. I think that particular option would be the best way to make Angel playable without being completely broken, but I don't think it's necessary. The other problem is Angel just dies to Killmonger after, like, if you destroy something before Killmongering and then Angel comes out, it would just get destroyed by your Killmonger later on. So perhaps changing its stat line to being a 2-3 or something like that, a 2-4, might make it more playable on itself, because when it does come out, it doesn't directly overlap with Embarku, something that does the exact same thing that it does, and it is a bit more valuable to have on the board. But the meta necessity: does the Angel really need a buff? Is the Destroy archetype really struggling? No, it's not. Bucky Barnes is the best card in the game, because it can be played at any location and you just don't care. So I don't think really that the deck needs help. So I don't think changing Angel would do anything to make the meta and general playability of Marvel Snap better. So this is not a card that really needs to be changed. So final verdict: it's okay sometimes for pool 1 cards to get replaced by other better stuff. That's how the game should progress, right? Next up, we've got Hawkeye. Hawkeye was a really surprising one for me to see on this list, because I think Hawkeye is really good. I think Hawkeye does one specific thing that I really want a card to do, and that is allow Adam Warlock's downside of having 0 power not be a problem and allow me to draw cards as fast as possible. So his current ability is, on reveal, if you play a card here next turn, plus 2 power. Now we have another card that exists in this design space, which is Rescue, and Rescue costs 4 and gets plus 4. So by the energy rating, Hawkeye is already better than the doubling that Rescue does. Rescue is on rate, 4 energy thing for 8 power, and the downside is that your next player is telegraphed. Hawkeye does kind of the same thing, except it's a 1/3. And there isn't really that many 1/3s. Now, I think it is super viable because, and I often recommend this as a replacement for Bass decks, but it's better than Yellow Jacket for guaranteeing Adam Warlock will draw a card on turn 2 because you can play Hawkeye all the way up to turn 5 and it's still relevant. It will still add 3 power. Yellow Jacket, any time after turn 2, usually bad. Usually not great. Not very helpful. Just as a generically high-powered, low-energy cost card compared to Wasp. I don't think Hawkeye really does need a change here. I don't think there's a struggling deck archetype that does get a buff from a Hawkeye boost. I don't think that there's a Zoo deck waiting for Hawkeye to get better. Khazar's kind of at a low place, but that's because the Khazar deck just kind of wants to play Ultron or nothing else. And I think maybe that is the thing that we should be looking at instead of something like this. Maybe the Shanna Khazar deck will actually make Hawkeye just be playable in the state that it is right now. But I don't think Hawkeye needs a change. I think Hawkeye just hasn't found its home yet. I just think a really competitive deck hasn't found Hawkeye to do the exact thing that it needs to do. I think playing Hawkeye 1 and playing Adam Warlock on 2 is really, really powerful. I've shipped this in some of my lists, and I think that it is definitely worth having a look at. Next up, Sandman. Sandman is, literally my latest video is about how broken Sandman is in a Ronin deck. So I think this is going to have a similar problem. So Sandman, ongoing, players can only play 1 card a turn. And the design space overlap is it has the same drawback as Elektra, but it doesn't have an upside. The upside is that it's a symmetrical effect. And then what's the solution here, right? A lot of people are calling for Sandman to have an increased power, but I think Sandman is already super viable. And in that deck video, what I talked about was you play Maximus on 3. Maximus has 7 power. Sandman on 4. Ronin on 5. Now, Sandman's secret ability is that your opponent's hand size cannot decrease in size unless if they are playing cards that say discard a card. So if you Maximus your opponent up to 7 cards in hand and you play Ronin, the maximum hand size your opponent can get down to is 6. And so Ronin's power is relatively fixed. And I think that Sandman operates really, really well in this space. However, I think contrary to Hawkeye, Sandman might be really helpful in solving some of the problems that we have with Zabu being completely unhinged and Sarah Miracle being pretty strong. But Leech kind of already does that. So I don't know if adding extra power to Sandman would solve these problems. If you had a 4 power 3 Sandman, I would just play him in the Zabu deck. I play 4 things that cost 4, and then I play Sandman right at the end, so my opponent can't play 6 things on turn 6. And I don't know if that is the solution. I don't know if that is a thing that would make it better. I think it is currently okay. If Ben Brode showed up at my house and put a gun to my head and he's like, change Sandman right now, I would be like, make it a 4/2. That's all I would do. That's like the absolute maximum I would accept in the negotiation. I think anything more than that would be ridiculous, and I think it would be just fine not changing it. And I think some of these cards are going to be things where the meta needs to develop to a place where people understand how powerful a card is in a certain situation. A lot of these decks are trying to play 3 or 4 things on the final turn. Sandman is really good about that, but you need to find a way to offset the fact that Sandman doesn't have a lot of power. I've been using Bast to do that, but also Maximus and Ronin do that. Alright, next up, we've got Medusa. So Medusa's current ability is, on reveal, if this is at the middle location, plus 2 power. And it has a weird design space overlap where Crystal and Quake both have that same restriction, but they have utility effects instead of power boosting effects, which seems strange to me. If Medusa had a utility effect, it would make sense for it to be restricted to the center, because then your opponent goes, oh, I'm worried about this utility effect, I will do something like play Cosmo Middle. And then they know that they can play around that. But Medusa doesn't do that. Now, the other overlap is something like Star-Lord, which we'll see in a minute, where Star-Lord cares about where your opponent has played things and then gets +3 if you guess correctly. Medusa just cares about being played in one place in particular and gets +2 for doing that. Now, I don't think that really does what is required of it in the design space. If it had a utility effect, it would make sense. But I think a crossbones type effect would be better. So if it was a 2 power, and instead it said on reveal, if you are losing this location +3 power, which means that if you're playing Medusa onto, your opponent would have had to have played something into a location first, and then you're playing Medusa into that location to add 5 to it, or even just adding 4 to it would be fine. Which means that you are then catching up against something, and then Medusa suddenly occupies this really niche space where if you think your opponent is setting up to try and draw cards with Adam Warlock on turn 2, Medusa will be played into that same location because they have to be winning it. Medusa gets a bunch of power, same as playing Lizard, and it guarantees that they're not going to draw a card, which I think would be really cool and would really work really well. And the other thing is that Marble Snap doesn't have a lot of catch-up mechanics. It doesn't have anything that says if you're losing this location. It doesn't have anything that is just like if you're losing in general. And I think maybe adding something like that would make this card super more playable. Because the other thing is that, because it's an on-reveal effect, it will only check at the exact time that that's happening. You can, on the final turn, play Medusa and then 3 other cards that also do things, and then go back to be winning that location. So I think that is something worth exploring, and I think that would make Medusa way more powerful and way more played, which I think was the goal of this question being asked of me in particular. Next up, we've got Elektra. Elektra is another one of those design space issue ones where its on-reveal effect is destroy a random enemy 1-cost card at this location. I feel like the original intention of it is having something in the early pools to deal with Kazar being such a big problem. But then once we get to further and further into pool 3, into pools 4 and 5, Elektra becomes useless because Killmonger exists, and Killmonger has a symmetrical effect which can help you out. So my thought is the way to fix this is to make it still do that thing. In pool 1, you can remove power from one of your opponent's 1 costs to keep yourself ahead in the race. However, in the later pools, the thing that we see a lot, and I wish I could Elektra, is the Sunspot on 1, Armor on 2. Now, if Elektra's effect was removed from game, or banish, exile, whatever, whichever keyword you prefer, then it would do that exact one job. It would become a utility card that solves a very specific problem, and suddenly it becomes useful because nothing else can do that. Nothing else can kill through armor like Elektra could. And I think that's the solution here. Because Elektra isn't played in a destroy archetype, we are not taking away a toy that they use, it just happens to have that keyword. And being able to destroy Sunspot would make this a utility card that is much more useful than it currently is, but solves the original design space problem that I think it has. So the new text would be, on reveal, remove an enemy 1-cost card from this location. Worded in the same way that Yondu is worded, where it just says remove. It doesn't explicitly specify what that means. But I think that is possibly the best solution. And then next up, we've got Agatha Harkness. This is an interesting one because I don't think anyone is looking at Agatha going, damn, I wish this card was more competitive. I love it when someone else plays Marble Snap for me. And because what Agatha does is she gives you an extra card in your starting hand, and then she plays all of your cards for you until you're able to discard that. And the design space overlap is Ego, the location that plays everyone's cards for them. And people complain about that location, and I don't think that people are going to want Agatha to be a thing that they want to play all the time. I think it is a goofy design challenge for a specific type of player like me that likes building a deck, that sees the downside and sees the upside of the high power and tries to build something fun or underplay this thing. I don't think anyone is intentionally trying to steal cubes with this deck. However, the easiest way to increase the viability is to tweak how good Agatha is at playing the game. I know bots exist that play the game good. I know bots exist that play the game bad. I'm just asking for Agatha to not throw every game that she's in. That's all. Alright? But is it necessary in the meta? Not really. Not every card needs to be viable and playable. Some cards are just allowed to be fun. However, if she shows up in Triskelion or the Hub or something like that where you get a random card put into your hand, you don't want to lose the game instantly because of that. And I think that is something worth maybe fixing. Now, here's my solution. Because we know Mephisto exists, card effects that interact with how many cubes you receive from playing a game are going to be effects in the game. And the other thing that's not mentioned in the card text is that Agatha takes all of the boosters from the games that you play. And so here's my trade offer. If you're going to punt all my cubes and take all my boosters, you can refund some of my cubes. So maybe we add an effect like there's a percentage chance of you retreating in the first couple of turns of the game. Like if you retreat in the first 3 turns of the game, you don't lose a cube. Agatha pays for the cube. Or you just in general have a chance to lose less cubes on average, which I don't think would be terrible. Like if the goal is to climb and you're already putting this extra challenge on you, this card isn't going to be so broken that not losing extra cubes suddenly means you're gaining heaps more cubes on average because it balances out. But I don't know, I think this is definitely a swinging for the fences kind of option. She is already a very interesting card. I have enjoyed playing her a lot. I have like 6 Infinity Splits on Agatha Harkness. I'm going to chase Inca 5 eventually. So I'm a big Agatha stan, but I don't think anything needs to be changed. Next up, Quake. Quake was the hardest one for me to look at. So what Quake does is, if this is at the middle location, swap the positions of each location. So this falls into the Medusa thing that we were talking about before, where Quake has a utility effect. And the design space overlap is Crystal and Starlight Citadel, which does the same thing. Now, this is a tougher one to try and needle down exactly what Quake is trying to solve, because there are so many different locations, and often the passive effect of a location doesn't care about where it is on the board. But the main interaction that I see is, if you can imagine something like negative zone. Your opponent hasn't played anything in a negative zone, but has a few other locations that are really full of cards. You can play Quake, and then you move the negative zone into a coin flip between those other 2 locations. And then all of a sudden your opponent is at a detriment because all their cards are getting -3. I think that is possibly the best outcome, but because there is so many locations and so much variance with each location, it's hard to know if Quake will just ever be useful. And so what do we do to make it more viable? Well, we need to make the effect feel less random, a little bit more control over where the effect will, the swapped location will end up, I think is the solution to this. So instead of it being played at the middle location, you play Quake at a particular location, and then that location is swapped with one of the other 2. Which means that if you go, okay, this negative space needs to move, it will go to one of these 2 things, right? Which is very similar to what it does already, but I think there's a bit more control over it. And yeah, the main problem is that Quake occupies really specific design space, and I feel like you would just always play Storm instead, or Scarlet Witch instead, right? Which does the same sort of thing. But I think needling down to being able to control and choose exactly which one moves, because with the new text, it means that 1 location doesn't move and 2 locations swap. So you would pick the one that you think is a problem. Like imagine how crazy this would be with something like Bar with No Name. You just pack a bunch of stuff in a Bar with No Name, and then you Quake, And then Bar with no name is going to go over to a thing that your opponent's got a bunch of stuff on, and they're like, oh damn, now I'm in trouble. Whoops. And I think it can sort of do that already, but because it is super random, it's difficult to know what's going on. But also, I don't really think that it does need a big change. I think the problem is that what it's trying to do and the way that the locations work is that the locations are way too random, and that Quake doesn't do enough to solve that problem for it to be picked over Scarlet Witch instead. Okay, next up is Star-Lord. We mentioned Star-Lord earlier because he's also underplayed and on the look occupies the same space as Medusa. Now, on reveal, if your opponent played a card here this turn, plus 3 power. So it's a 2/5, it's on rate with Lizard, and it is 1 more than Medusa, because Medusa is like, look, you just have to aim at the center location, and Star-Lord, like, you have to aim as wherever your opponent's going to play a card. And the design space overlap is actually huge. There is heaps of Guardians cards, I think 5. Each of them is very, very similar. It has the same effect, but ranging power and costs. Now, I think if you were like, look, we really, really want Star-Lord to be playable, okay, you could invert the effect. If your opponent did not play a card here this turn, plus 3 power. And what that means is you can play it on curve. Most of the time it's going to be a 2/5. That's probably broken, but if you play it later on, it's going to be harder to navigate because they're much more likely to be playing cards later on. It's going to be harder to navigate getting exactly the right thing, which is going to make it more consistent. You'll probably need to change it to be plus 2 power instead of plus 3 power, because in the same way as what Medusa does, it would need to be less consistent in always being a 2/5. But the other thing is that it probably doesn't really need a change if it's already on rate with Lizard, and Lizard is pretty powerful. But here's what I think is the problem with the Guardians cycle, is that we have 5 of them. That's half a deck, right? They all have the same effect in the same way that there's plenty of destroy cards, there's plenty of other ongoing cards, all these kind of things that make an archetype by overlapping in the same way, but it doesn't have its own archetype. Even though they all do the same thing with guess where your opponent's going to be. Now, I think the solution to stuff like Star-Lord, and I think in general the Guardian series is underplayed, I think the solution is to release more cards that make it easier for your opponent's plays to be guessed. Add more cards that turn the Guardian cycle into its own archetype. Now, I think something like Juggernaut does the opposite, where Juggernaut says the thing that you play is no longer here. I think what instead you would need a card, for example, that says your opponent must play a card here this turn. And then you could add cards like Spider-Man. You can add cards like all these other stuff, like Storm, that closes out a location, and it narrows down your opponent's choices of where they can put things so that the Guardians cards can be played, all of them. And I think it could just be one card. You could play a 1-drop that says next turn your opponent must play a card here. And it's like a 1/1 or something like that, and suddenly that on 1, Star-Lord on 2, really powerful. Storm on 3, Drax on 4, right? Gamora on 5, Spider-Man, something, all this kind of stuff comes together all of a sudden and makes a deck. So I think that the problem isn't the specific Star-Lord card. I don't think the problem is the specific Guardians of the Galaxy cards. I think that we need to build an archetype, an entire play style that matches knowing where your opponent's going to play things. Okay, next up is Blackbolt. Blackbolt's a tough one. On reveal, your opponent must discard the lowest cost card in their hand, and has a design space overlap with Moon Knight, where Moon Knight will make you discard a random card. But both people do. It is symmetrical. Blackbolt is not symmetrical, and I think there's maybe 2 options, right? But I think the problem comes down to the intention of Blackbolt, because it's really not obvious. If the intention of Blackbolt is to deal with cards like She-Hulk and Death that become 0 really fast, Blackbolt's pretty good. However, with stuff like Moon Girl, with the fact that there is both She-Hulk and Death, I think just getting 1 card isn't good enough. I think it should be your opponent discards the lowest cards if there's ties. So if they have 4 things that cost 0, it discards 4 things. And then that kind of does the same thing that Leech does in the way that Death just isn't playable because it costs 9 and you'll now have 9 mana on the final turn. I think that is more kind of doing the same thing, right? We are also getting Stature, which is coming soon, which will suddenly be playable with Blackbolt because Stature gets a cost reduction if your opponent's discarded a card. And I don't know that not changing Blackbolt and just releasing Stature fixes Blackbolt's problem in the same way that releasing new cards might make the Guardians cards more playable. I think Blackbolt needs to narrow down what the card is that is trying to be discarded. If the point is to get rid of your opponent's huge play, then maybe it should be the highest cost card instead of the lowest cost card. Because in Magic the Gathering, your opponent discarding stuff is in every format. Like Thoughtseize is one of the most played cards because it deals with so many things. Like same as like Cabal Therapy and stuff like that. So if Blackbolt discarded their highest card, you would never have leader problems. No one would complain about leader. It would solve things, but then decks like Ramp, which play multiple 6-cost things, decks like Lockjaw, which play multiple 6-cost things, would not have a problem. Decks like Dracula type decks that are trying to get a big Apocalypse in just get a big boost from me playing a Blackbolt. I don't think changing it to highest cost card would be ridiculous, and I don't think making it discard multiple of the lowest cost cards. Like if your opponent's just got 6 1-drops in hand and you discard 6 1-drops, that's just as impactful as if you discarded Infinite or Leader out of their hand and that was what they were intending on playing. So I think either of those options are fine, but the point is we just don't know what Blackbolt's original intention was when it was designed, and it needs to be honed towards solving whatever problem it was made to solve. And then the next one is Punisher. I was surprised at this also showing up. I played Punisher a lot, playing Spectrum. I played Spectrum for a very long time, and then I still played Punisher in Omega Red. So I was playing it into Pool 3, so I don't think this is a card that just gets dropped as you progress down the track. But its effect is ongoing, +1 power for each opposing card at this location. And what's funny is we were just talking about releasing new cards that make old cards more viable. I think we have literally just done that, and the meta has just not caught up with it. We have 2 cards already that say play a lot of stuff, that is Dazzler and Mojo. And I think the Punisher weirdly fits nicely into that space. So there might be a deck that plays something like Dr. Octopus or Debris, and helps fill up these locations, and then play something like Punisher and Mojo and Dazzler all together, because that's a really nice curve out, right? 2, 3, 4. And then is kind of using that advantage to build up a power advantage over your opponent. The other thing is that I don't think that the stat line needs any change, because it is on rate with Swordmaster, and the downside of Swordmaster is that you just don't play it outside of a discard deck. But the downside for Punisher is that your opponent didn't play a lot of cards in this location. If your opponent didn't play a lot of cards in this location, Punisher's still good. If your opponent played no cards in this location, being a 3/2 wins you that location. So I don't think it's underperforming, and I think it's on rate with other cards. Like Maximus is an outlier. I think Maximus is 3/7 is kind of ridiculous. And I think Swordmaster is fine, right, for being on rate. 2/5, 3/6, 4/8, not crazy, right? So the final verdict, I think with the release of Dazzler, that kinds of decks that are trying to fill up all squares with stuff like Ultron. I play a Zoo deck that fills up every square with Bishop and Mysterio. So I think these kind of outcomes are actually more likely, and Punisher is already stronger in the meta, but people just haven't caught up with playing it yet. And the last thing is, that was it. Oh, that's all 10. I'm shocked. But I think that talking about a lot of these things is really interesting because a lot of the time the discussions around these kinds of things are all like, this thing is broken, it beat me many times, I hate it, it's made the game unfun, it needs to be nerfed. And I think that the discussion about, hey, these things are underperforming, or these things that I like and I think are cool haven't shown up a lot. I just got a really nice variant for this particular card, but I can't play it because it's not meta. And doing things that changes the meta environment to make more things viable, or make underplayed cards more played, or making them solve a very specific design problem like Elektra does, where Elektra really only operates in pool 1. Giving it options to make it more effective in pool 2 would be really, really good. But what do you think? Is there any card that you wish would get a buff? I probably have a long list of stuff that I would change given the opportunity. But I'm interested in what you're thinking, what you would change. And if you're here, check out some of the other Marvel Snap content that I make. I'll put up some buttons here for you to have a look up. I've got a big Marvel Snap playlist of stuff that I put things on, and a whole bunch of other deck techs and discussions about different design stuff in the game. Because I think Marvel Snap is really cool. And I think there's a lot to be talked about with how it's put together. But that's it from me. I hope I can catch you later on in the same channel.